I'm going to turn the session over to my colleagues, Teresa Dade Boone and Cameron Sue, both of them with Contra Costa County Health Services. And Cameron, I'm going to let you share your screen and take it away. And folks, if you would put any questions you have in the chat at the end of our discussion, Cameron and Teresa will speak first about the nature of pods, their experience from a county health perspective with pods. And then I'll talk to you just a couple of minutes about why CERTs are particularly valuable as volunteer support for pods. And then we'll take questions. We should be wrapped up within an hour. So Cameron, you want to take it away? I'll let you and Teresa introduce yourselves.
And good evening, everyone. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Good evening, everyone. My name is Cameron Sue, and I'm a emergency planning coordinator with Contra Costa Health. Some of my responsibilities include medical countermeasures and SNS stuff, or strategic national stockpile type stuff. Kind of some of my background is actually, in going into some of my background, I actually started with Contra Costa Health about 3 years ago. I was first hired on as a contact tracer during the COVID-19 pandemic. I later transitioned over into the county's vaccine efforts and worked at the Waterworld mass vaccination site. From there, I became a site testing lead of the San Ramon testing site, and then later was responsible for vaccine management, almost when the operations or the vaccine response turned into more of like a daily operations. And so with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Teresa for her introduction.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Margaret, for having us today. Hello, my name is Teresa Dade Boone. I'm the volunteer program coordinator, and I was brought on in October of 2020. We were right in smack dab in the middle of the pandemic. And so I'm still in the same role. So I'm still a volunteer program coordinator, but I transitioned from the Office of the Director under the Contra Costa Health Emergency Response Unit. And so I did a lot of onboarding of volunteers from that duration of time when COVID was really in full force, and also transitioned in 2023, January 2023, as the Medical Reserve Corps coordinator as well. So I've kind of sort of had a dual role. So I work alongside all of the CERTs in the county and also support the Medical Reserve Corps, as well as support community volunteers. And community volunteers are mainly those who I onboarded during the COVID pandemic. And my role also takes me into the universities and colleges. So I also onboard student nurses within our public health department, and student nurses, community health workers, people in WIC. So these interns come on and they get their hours through us. So I'm enjoying all of that.
So welcome to our presentation on pods and volunteers. Before we get into the presentation, I think Teresa and I like to kind of preface, when it comes to the world of emergency management and volunteers, our language becomes so common to us that we forget that it becomes almost like a second language to everyone else. So throughout this presentation, we're going to do our best to clarify any terms, provide any definitions, or if we talk about an acronym, hopefully explain that acronym so more of that language becomes more common among this whole group. As it has already been mentioned, questions are welcome. We ask that you put them in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them closer to the end of our presentation. So let's talk about what is MCM, or what is medical countermeasures. Medical countermeasures applies to any drug, vaccine, or antitoxin that would be used during kind of a CBRN type event, or chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear event. Specifically for the Bay Area, medical countermeasures kind of has its origins back in 2001, when there was a series of anthrax attacks. The federal government actually made it a priority for local health departments to prepare and respond to a possible biological attack. Um, since then, since in 2004 specifically, bioterrorism became probably the majority of what medical countermeasures would be used in the Bay Area. And actually, the MCM coordinators from the different local health jurisdictions began meeting informally to create a group of how we prepare for a biological attack. That group later became more formal and became what we now know as the Bay Area Mass Prophylaxis Working Group. So let's talk about pods for a bit. There's a couple kinds of pods, which Margaret kind of alluded to. There's commodity pods, which would be more of a county office of emergency services function, where they would provide services and goods in the event like a natural disaster or man-made event that would require these goods to go out to the public. For the health department, more specifically, we're responsible for MPODs, or medical points of distribution. These are sites that we would stand up in the event of a CBRN type event, dispense medications to the public, or provide mass prophylaxis to the public. Now, there's basically two kinds of pods that we're going to be talking about today. The first one being the open pod. Now, in layman's terms, in simple terms, this is a site that's open to the public. Contra Costa Health would both provide the planning partner staff, supplies, and personnel to basically work in that pod, and then the partner would provide actually the facility. Now, closed pods are kind of the opposite or the flip side of an open pod. Basically, they are sites that it's the responsibility of the partner to handle all of the logistics. And now, with talking about pods, probably the biggest thing to point out here is that they are responsible for helping prevent medical surge among our health system. Basically, keeping the health system from getting overwhelmed with either like patients that would possibly go to like an emergency room following one of these types of emergencies. So we've talked about pods, we've talked about mass prophylaxis or mass dispensing. I think it's important to note the shelf life extension program and what that is. So the shelf life extension program has its origins back in 1986. The Department of Defense did a study and found that a lot of medications following like a natural disaster or man-made event still maintain their potency a certain time after the actual expiration date that's on the package. So for instance, potassium iodide, which is a medication that would be used following like a nuclear or radiological event to help deal with the side effects that come with that type of an event. It maintains 90% of its potency 124 months past its actual expiration date. Acetaminophen, for that matter, or commonly known as Tylenol, again, maintains 90% of its potency 2 years past its actual expiration date. And where we connect that to the present day is that a lot of these medications that are dispensed to the public, actually, based off the shelf life extension program, can be used past their expiration date, but that's also dependent on county and state guidance as well. So let's talk about that last definition that's on our NCM slide here, which is the Strategic National Stockpile. Well, when I first joined with Contra Costa Health and I heard about the Strategic National Stockpile, it conjured up images of Indiana Jones and probably the first Indiana Jones film where they're pushing around a cart in a warehouse. The SNS is definitely not like that. Actually, it's more of just a series of warehouses that are contracted out through a partner around the country that has basically vaccinations, antitoxins, and medications that would deal with like a CBRN type event. And these medications, in the event they are needed, would basically be delivered to the state warehouse, and then from there, from the state warehouse, would come to the local health jurisdiction to be dispensed out through a local distribution site. And so that's kind of the gist of medical countermeasures. And I'm going to hand it over to Teresa, who is going to introduce you to the talk about volunteers.
Thank you, Cameron. So I just wanted to explain to you the different types of volunteers that I have actually personally onboarded. So our first definition is affiliated volunteers, and these are volunteers who are affiliated with a governmental agency or recognized with a nonprofit organization, and that trains for specific disaster response and recovery. So some types of affiliated volunteers may include the MRC, Medical Reserve Corps, our CERT team, such as yourself, different volunteer organizations active in disaster, such as VOAD, the American Red Cross, our COADs. So those are our volunteers who are affiliated. Then we have our volunteers who are what we consider spontaneous. And so during COVID, we onboarded a lot of spontaneous volunteers. Most of them were not in patient-facing activities, but they were very instrumental in supporting us in setting up our largest pod, vaccine pod at Waterworld. So spontaneous volunteers are all assumed to be volunteers who are not officially involved, but are motivated by the incident or the desire to just help in times of trouble. So they come with a variety of skills, and they may come from within the affected areas or from outside the area. I received a lot of people from Alameda County when we put out the call for support. And so all spontaneous volunteers are processed as an unaffiliated volunteer. They will not work, as I said, in any patient-facing centered care or clinical type of systems. So unaffiliated volunteers, as again, they're not a formal volunteer in a formal voluntary system. And so these types can also be known as a convergent, emergent volunteer, a walk-in, or as I said earlier, a spontaneous volunteer. Then we have what we call DSWs, which means disaster service workers. These are persons designated by the state and the law, state law and the city ordinance to provide more services and aid during declared emergencies, including recovery of phase of an emergency, disaster, or a catastrophe. So all DSWs complete a loyalty oath upon signing their DSW form. And so I'm quite sure as a CERT, you have had to take a DSW, complete a DSW form and take an oath of loyalty. So that is what the disaster service workers mean. That's what DSW means. And we'll move on to the next slide with Cameron.
Sorry, folks, had a little technical issue there. Actually, I think I jumped ahead one, or actually,
Yeah, you went ahead one slide. If you can go back.
I'm going to go back. My apologies about that.
That's okay.
Okay, so let's talk about pod plan basics. Now, there's different plans within the medical countermeasures program, and there's different. But what we're going to provide for you today are probably the most basics when it comes to understanding these plans, and we're going to basically hit kind of like the highlights. The first of being, when are pods? What situations require pods? The first is, as we mentioned before, is a CBRN event, a chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear event. Or, as we know with the pandemic, emerging infectious diseases. Now, I know that image on the left-hand side of the gentleman in the hazmat suit's a little bit misleading. While we are not responsible for the decon from a CBRN event, we'd be handing out either medications or vaccines following one of these events. And so the next kind of situation or kind of event where pods would be necessary would be during like a natural disaster. Specifically speaking, during Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, pods were used to help provide medications to the public that were experiencing infections from exposure to floodwaters down there. And so they also were helpful in providing medications for people that had to leave their homes and leave all their life-saving medications behind. Another situation where pods could be useful is during basically home fires, right? In home fires, you have seconds to get out of your house. And so that's another situation when pods can be useful. If we find that the county specifically is experiencing a wildfire that affects multiple homes, pods could be useful in providing people those life-saving medications. So let's talk about where pods are located. So there are basically two, as we mentioned, there's two kinds of pods. There's opens and closed pods, and they can be in every pretty much in every city around your county. Specifically speaking, the picture that you're looking at right there is of the Richmond Auditorium. We actually used the Richmond Auditorium during the pandemic to provide vaccinations to the public, as well as testing to the public as well. And so it was kind of like a merged pod model. Um, and there's with using these facilities, you want to look for some basic functions. And the first step being it has to be ADA accessible. That actually is a requirement. And secondly, it could be an indoor outdoor facility. And thirdly, you want to make sure that your pod can handle the appropriate amount of people for the facility. You don't want your pod to be overwhelmed with people coming into the facility, and you want a layout that's basically conducive to the flow of people coming in and out of the pod. So let's talk. Speaking of flow, let's talk about the main sections of a pod, and we'll go into basically the positions a little bit later on. But like as we mentioned, we basically want an entry and exit, and it's going to be like kind of like a one-way flow, in and out of the pod. The first step being is the first section that you want within that flow is the greeting person. This is a person that's basically kind of set the precedent for the rest of the pod, or for what your patients may experience when coming to a point of dispensing site. The next person after that would be someone who basically looks at the forms and makes sure that these forms are basically they provide a set of medical questions, and they help determine basically the right medium of distribution for when it comes to accepting the medications later on in the treatment section. The screening section basically kind of determines your flow of the patient through the pod. And lastly, your patient will receive the medication kind of in the treatment section. And we'll go into the positions a little bit later on of what positions work under these various sections. So I'll kind of hand it over to Teresa, who will go over how will a pod be staffed.
Okay, so pods are staffed by various people. Of course, we work in public health, so there is opportunity for public health staff to be first called upon to staff a pod. But as you know from the pandemic, as most of you know from the pandemic, we needed all hands on deck. So depending on the situation, we will reach out to our community, or we will activate our Medical Reserve Corps or reach out to our CERTs. And so it just depends on the situation. So if we don't need a large amount of people, it may just be we reach out to CERT and we don't actually reach out to the Medical Reserve Corps or reach out to our county volunteers. So it really, really depends on the situation. People also come representing many different professions, disciplines, different agencies. We may work directly with the American Red Cross, and they may say, okay, we're working with you, but we need you to provide additional volunteers. And they will let us know what that staffing would look like. So those sources of staff, again, will come from public health and hospitals, other first responders. We also work with EMTs, and also EMTs and any other, and the Medical Reserve Corps would be considered part of our first responders as well as our different volunteers, such as CERT, our VOADs, COADs, or even working with the American Red Cross, and they will let us know what type of staffing that they would need.
And kind of as Teresa mentioned, we could also be working with like the National Guard as well when it comes to staffing pods. And we actually did that during the pandemic, where we made a request through the Mohawk system. And we'll go into that in just a little bit. So let's talk about the activation of volunteers. So a disaster happens. And this is kind of like the tentative timeline. Um, Again, depending on whatever situation that may happen, this is kind of like the general framework that is kind of followed when you're activating volunteers. So, as our supervisor likes to says that whenever a disaster happens, there's always kind of like a medical health component to it. So it's a disaster, but it could also be a health emergency as well. When that disaster does happen, we activate what they call the Medical Health Operational Area Coordination System. I know that's a full mouthful. But basically what that is that it's basically how our medical system throughout the county coordinates in the event of a disaster. And at the head of that, at the lead of that is our Mohawk coordinator. And he's usually the emergency medical services director, uh, who is in charge of basically being that instant commander type person that would help determine what is appropriate and what is needed in the event of a disaster. Now, speaking specifically to the Mohawk system, um, specifically, from there, if the resources are tapped within our system, and not to get again to deviate from volunteers, he can make a request out to the region or other medical health operational area coordinators, and that would be through our regional disaster medical health coordinators. And so he's kind of like the next level up, and then from there they would go out to the state. So, but let's bring it back down to the county, okay? So the medical health operational area coordinator determined that volunteers are needed. And so this is where kind of like Teresa would come in terms of providing instructions to volunteers and activating volunteers.
Yes. So if in the case of the Mohawk activating volunteers,
My apologies.
that's okay. They would reach out to, I would receive a message and they would reach out to me, um, stating basically what their need or their request will be. So generally what the Mohawk does is I will receive a message from the Mohawk directly or from EMSA, and EMSA is our Emergency Medical Services Authority with the state, and they will reach out to me and say, "Well, Teresa, we need RNs, we need medical doctors, we need PAs." They will give me the type of medical designation that is needed. Now, for example, not this past January, I think it was January of 2023, when we had the really bad storms again. Um, we were requested to support down in Monterey and Santa Cruz County, but the request was not specifically for direct medical support, but for behavioral medical support. And so folks were I received a request. I filled the request through our DHV system, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. Our disaster healthcare volunteer system. I built the request, submitted it, and it goes out until our Medical Reserve Corps folks then answer that call, and then um, based on what the need was, EMSA then said, okay, they need to be deployed down to Monterey and Santa Cruz. So it's really based on what the incident is and the request from the MOAC as to make the determination of the volunteers. Once that DHV list is activated, the system was utilized to establish the requested staff and the skills that are needed. Generally, housing and transportation is also needed at that time, and so if they are deployed out past our county, they are provided with housing and transportation. Then we will look, and again, depending on need, for additional volunteers may be contacted once public health officials have been notified. And so they will then say, okay, we will notify the city. And that's where CERTs come in. So one of the questions that, comes up often is, how are CERTs notified? So in an actual disaster, our public health officials will contact each city, and each city will then contact the CERT to be deployed out. In the case that it is not an actual disaster or an emergency, or someone reaches out and says, we're having this event, or we're having some type of we can just say a screening or something, we need additional support. That's not a disaster. So I can directly reach out to the CERT without having to go through the city. So again, if in a declared emergency, volunteers will be called upon. Volunteers also will be specified according to their need. And then any volunteers outside of the MRC, as I said, will be contacted via city officials. So that is basically how our volunteers are contacted from our MOOC.
So volunteers, as you heard, can pretty much make a difference in an emergency management and public health type situation. Now, there are basically two types of volunteers. There can be medical volunteers that are kind of associated with our or an organization like our Medical Reserve Corps, and then there could be non-medical volunteers, and they would have responsibilities that are more broad, like they could provide more logistical type support for our point of dispensing sites. So let's kind of go into that structure and kind of explore that just for just a little bit. So this is kind of the point of dispensing site from one of our MCM plans. It's basically the ICS structure of where a pod would come into play. So you have your emergency operations center. They'd be coordinating both security for the point of dispensing site, and they would be also coordinating with our point of dispensing site manager. On the opposite side, kind of to your left, I think my right, is basically public health operations, and they would be kind of merging and also coordinating with our site manager. The site manager would have an operations lead who would basically be running things, and he'd be coordinating with the different supervisors at every kind of station within a pod. And so you basically just kind of following the ICS kind of structure and just basic themes. It'd be important. It's important to note that you could actually be wearing multiple hats during the course of like a response. So I can speak specifically when I was running the ceremonial testing site, and when we were going into the more of the daily operations and then kind of the demobilization. I worked basically the registration portion of it, and I was also providing logistical support. So I was running supplies uh, to my nurses who were testing people as they came through the site. I was also basically coordinating the flow of the site. I was kind of like the client flow supervisor as well. At one point, when we made that transition as well from so backing up a little bit, there's two types of testing that we did during the pandemic at our testing sites. There was PCR testing, and then there was antigen testing. And basically, when we made that transition to antigen testing, it took longer for us to test people. And so what we had to do at the ceremonial testing site is that we built a snake, or basically we extended the route to enter the site to build capacity. So I was also kind of like the client flow supervisor as well. While we didn't provide vaccinations, I while I was considered a non-medical supervisor at the site, I was responsible for my nurses as well. And while I wasn't actually training them up, I would actually refer them to subject matter experts within our organization that would provide them the appropriate training. And then also too, we had our non-medical staff were responsible for also they were responsible for basically the registration side of things when coming to the pod. And so there's a possibility in following kind of like the ICS principles of basically like a structured format is that you could be wearing multiple hats when you're working at a point of dispensing site. You could be asked to be, working as a screener. You could be asked to run medications, and you can also be asked to, help out with the registration duties as well. So there's many responsibilities there. So the picture that you're looking at actually here is an aerial drone shot of the ceremony testing site. Some things that again, responses that while we didn't have when I was working at the ceremony testing site, we transitioned into more daily operations, so we didn't have volunteers there. But when I took it over, one of the biggest things that we could have used at the ceremony testing site that could have helped us out in so many situations is having volunteers actually help us out. I know during the initial setup, just from hearing about it, volunteers can also help us out with setting up your actual point of dispensing site. Volunteers, depending on their certifications and training, can also be responsible for basically the dispensing of medications. Now, kind of vaccinations are kind of that funny one where you have to have someone um, who is medically certified and trained to provide that vaccination. But when it comes to more of dispensing medications, um, we don't need medical staff to dispense that medication. So, for instance, when you're talking about when you're resorting back to and referring back to the original model for medical countermeasures, which again is a response to a biological incident. Basically, if a pod were to be stand up, basically the pod would be dispensing the pill form of medication or Cipro or ciprofloxacin. That's a pill that can be handed out by both either a medical staff member or a non-medical staff member, but only and so that's where dispensing kind of comes into play. Uh, Volunteers can also help out with crowd control and traffic control. Um, when I was a site supervisor at the ceremony testing site, I would cover for some shifts at the Richmond Auditorium. And during that time, when we were providing vaccinations at the Richmond Auditorium, I could have used volunteers to help me organize, basically, and provide traffic control for the people in the front, as we had basically a line around the block. And they would have truly helped out with and made that difference when it comes to basically helping provide traffic control and crowd management for the people out front. And lastly, we can have volunteers to provide general safety for all staff. It helps providing that extra eyes on site to keep basically a high level overview and awareness of what's going on. And so if something weird were to happen or a situation were to happen, a volunteer can help out and refer and call over like a site supervisor like myself to help handle the situation. So I'll hand it over to Teresa.
So how would you protect yourself as a volunteer at a pod? I think this question comes up quite a bit because you are put on the front line. So first and foremost, you would receive the medication. So volunteers would be dispensed the medication or vaccine for themselves or their families prior to volunteering. That way you are covered. And this was a lot of questions that came up during COVID with a lot of volunteers, will I be able to get the vaccine? And so again, if they weren't in any specific patient facing situation, most of the time we were masked up, so we were trying to stay safe. But in a lot of situations, we were able to provide that vaccine so that they could continue to support us at the pod sites. Also, you will receive just-in-time training. Volunteers are provided this because it is really important to know, first of all, what your role is. So as Cameron alluded to, we have all types of roles. So you can, from safety to crowd control to dispensing medication. So if you're going to dispense medication, there would be a specific training on that medication based on a person's age, the dosage, what they would be receiving. So you would definitely get that medication before you start going to work in any specific pod. Again, PPE comes up a lot. We want to make sure that all our volunteers are provided, or medical personnel provided, the appropriate PPE, such as during COVID, we provided masks, and I even had shields. I still got boxes of shields. So if you would like to have some, I have some for you. And then, if gloves are needed, whatever, if you need to be in a specific Tyvek suit, we hope that we don't get to that point, but we have those available. Cameron will tell you. So we will provide the appropriate personal protective equipment depending on the cause. And then lastly, we will try to, it's really, really important for volunteers to know. So when you are on the ground with us, we want to make sure that you are updated with all the organizational developments that come through in regards to volunteer management or the disaster response. So this is not a time to not share. We will keep you abreast of what is going on. Maybe the pod have to be extended for an appropriate amount of time, or and I know that distribution is there's a set number of distribution that goes out each day. So these are things that we will discuss with you as a volunteer to make sure that you understand that we're not trying to cover 5,000 people in one day. So, and pods may be all over the county as well. So these are things that we will discuss with you as far as being a volunteer. Next slide, Cameron. And so as you prepare to work in a pod, it's really, really important for you to have a plan with your family first and foremost. There is a family planning training, I believe, for preparedness for your family, just in case you have to be activated. And so it's really, really important for you to plan and for your family to understand your role as a CERT or a volunteer in a situation such as this. So definitely, I encourage you to have that family preparedness plan with your family. Because if you say I'm going out to volunteer, CERTs do all types of support. So it may not just be just a pod. It may be going door to door. We may be in an earthquake situation, but you want to make sure that you have some type of plan with your family to make sure you're safe and you're communicating back to them so that they know that you're all right as well. We don't want to put anybody in harm's way if we don't have to. So we want to make sure people have plans. It's important to take ICS training. I'm quite sure you've taken quite a bit of it. Lately, with the Medical Reserve Corps, we were only requiring 100 and 700. We have now incorporated one ICS 200. And some are also taking an opportunity to take ICS 800. So these are also ICS courses that I would definitely recommend that you and refresh every now and then, because they are one and done. They're one and done. And I also try to let my Medical Reserve Corps volunteers understand they are one and done. And sometimes if we want to just take a refresher on the ICS, that's fine. Let's do that so that they stay abreast of it. Also update your contact. Be sure I have your appropriate contact, and everything is current. We are currently going through our DHV system, which is the Disaster Healthcare Volunteer System, and this is managed by the state. And the state is getting ready to upgrade that system. And one of the things they're encouraging everyone is make sure they have the appropriate contact information, your updated phone numbers, your updated email addresses, your updated emergency contacts. It is really, really important. And so I don't know if any of the CERTs have a actual system that you're using. A lot of us to this day, some of us still use an Excel spreadsheet. And, if that's the way we got to get down, that's the way we got to get down. But, if you maintain this information and make sure it's up to date. And people do move, people's phone numbers do change, and we have gone from, most people are doing Gmails now. Used to be Yahoo and AT&T.net, things like that. But a lot of people now have built a Gmail email address. Also, very, very important is to have a go bag. Make sure your go bag is prepared and ready to go. And make sure it's accessible to where you can grab it. If I'm upstairs, I have an upstairs and downstairs in my house, the bag is on the back of my door in my bedroom. I don't need it to be downstairs in the closet where I can't, if something happens, I can't really get to it. So I just try to make sure my go bag is prepared and ready for me to just grab it and walk. So, and I know this is preaching to the choir because most of you understand this as CERT members, but we just want to make sure to reiterate this, to definitely have your go bag ready. Thank you, Cameron.
So we're kind of getting into my favorite kind of portion of this presentation. And as a preparedness person, we love having go bags. We love having everything that we can in our go bags. But really, when it comes to working at a pod, we recommend probably bringing as little as possible. Now, there are some notable mentions when it comes to specifically working at a pod. The first thing is just general sanitation. We recommend having some hand sanitizer on hand and some hand wipes. When I was running the Ceremony testing site, we were running a outdoor facility that basically only had access to porta potties. And so having some extra hand sanitizer hand made sure that, that you were maintaining kind of clean practices when it comes to handling like documents or handling the different items that were around the point of dispensing site. As Teresa mentioned before, kind of the second thing is that we recommend having a little bit of PPE ready to go in your go bag as well. So, I mean, that could be anywhere from like an N95 to having just an extra set of like gloves on hand in the event is something that you don't really want to touch or something that is kind of dirty. Um, the third thing that we kind of mentioned that should probably be in your go bag is that we recommend having an ID. That ID is essential for identifying anyone who walks up on a pointed dispensing site. Now, we recommend that because you are a volunteer, also too, if your organization does have an ID, that you bring that with you as well. Because anyone who walks up a pointed dispensing site, there's a lot of people at a point dispensing site, and the environment is very dynamic. And so we want to make sure we're able to identify the appropriate people that should be working on the site and probably the people that shouldn't be working at the site as well. So, and the last thing that we want to recommend that you have in your go bag is basically having some snacks and having some water. When we were working at the ceremony testing site, there were many times when people would basically be working all day, and then they would take a break and they wouldn't have any food or water on hand. So having that extra food and water just kind of makes a difference between having a good experience and or a bad experience when you're volunteering at a point of dispensing site. So let's kind of take you through basically the procedures of what to do when you first arrive at a point of dispensing site. And the first thing that you would do is, and when it comes to working at any pod, whether you are a volunteer or not, is that basically you would find the sign in. I know for CERT and for the Medical Reserve Corps, when we had that for our volunteers that basically worked at our point of dispensing sites, Teresa would provide them with a QR code that way that they could sign in to make sure that there is some sort of record of them being at the point of dispensing site. From there, we'd recommend that you steal your go bag, whether it be in your car or someplace nearby that basically doesn't have the public doesn't have access to, and that's for obvious reasons. From there, we recommend donning probably the appropriate form of PPE. Now, when I had people work at the ceremony testing site, whether they be volunteers or general staff, I had them basically wear, not only did they wear like a face covering, but since it was an outdoor site with lots of traffic around, I would have them wear neon vests, and this would make sure and keep them safe and visible to cars that were constantly coming through the ceremony testing site because it was an outdoor drive-through testing site. After they don the appropriate PPE, whether it be neon vests or face covering, we would either provide them the just-in-time training, or specifically for the ceremony testing site, we would basically pair them with a person who is more experienced in that field that can provide them that just-in-time training. And that way, they can shadow them and mentor them through the shift and provide them and answer any questions that they may have. Now, before the shift starts, either the site lead or their designee would provide just kind of like a huddle or safety briefing where they would basically go over the operations of the day, um, any expectations of the day, and then anything to look out for and how to maintain your safety while on site. With speaking of the ceremony testing site, I think this was the time when, and with it being an outdoor testing site, when it was open, we would provide briefings also too when there would be like extreme weather out, when there would be thunderstorms out. We'd provide recommendations to staff of what to do and how to remain safe in the event of one of those extreme weather conditions. Now, the volunteer would perform and support the functions of the point of dispensing site. And before going home, we recommend that the volunteer basically sign out, fill out their ICS 214 form or activity form, and then basically any demobilization efforts. And so that means basically like returning equipment, returning their PPE, and then making sure everything is locked up and secure. And they would be working with the site supervisor on something like that. And then finally, they would go home after that. And so that's kind of like the activation process and kind of the basic gist of working a shift at a point of dispensing site. So we're kind of getting into the kind of the knowledge check of this presentation. A lot of these questions, I think we've covered a lot of these questions within this knowledge check, and some of them we haven't really covered, but they're meant to inspire discussion. So we're using for this portion of the presentation a thing called Mentimeter. And so when we do roll up the screen, we recommend that you go to menti.com, which is this last uh, kind of bullet point at the bottom of the page, and then putting it in the code, and then you can respond to the prompt. Okay. And so involves a presentation, and we ask that all volunteers and everyone on this call participate. We're going to give you a little bit of time, and then we're going to talk about it as a group and everything like that. Okay, so we'll get into the first knowledge check.
Cameron, can you read the code off? It's kind of small.
Oh yeah, so the code after going to menti.com, which is spelled MENTI.com, you're gonna type in the code 270821. And so basically the first question is list a unique item in your go bag that would be useful in working at a point of dispensing site. And we're gonna give you a couple of minutes to respond to this question.
You guys are doing great.
All right, we'll give you just a little bit more time to respond. All right. Okay. Thank you guys all for responding. Um, we just want to point out some items. Who responded backup cell phone battery?
That was a great one.
Yeah, can you take yourself on mute and explain why that would be a useful item when working at a pod?
That was me. I
Good.
just, that is having communication and auxiliary communication at all times is just an important service support need. Sometimes these locations, I worked a couple of the vaccination sites during the pandemic, the cell phone coverage wasn't great. It was continuously roaming. I would lose my cell service easily. So it's just a standard need.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret. That's great. Even when we were working at like an indoor site, a lot of times a lot of the outlets are either like taken up by someone charging their laptop or computer. And so it's nice to keep your cell phone charged just for personal preparedness reasons, as well as to have access to communication with other members at like a point of dispensing site. So who responded ham radio? Can you take yourself on mute and kind of explain why that would be a good item in your go bag?
Here we go speaking. Just kind of following on from what Margaret said is something we have in our area we have some dead spots where it's difficult, and a lot of the hams have a handheld ham radio that we can carry, so it's helpful.
Thank you so much. Exactly right. Communication can be a little bit spotty, and I know, and I can speak specifically to the ceremony testing site. In the valley, sometimes there are just some dead zones, and so having an alternate means of communication, whether it be like a cell phone or a ham radio, is also another useful item in your go bag. And then lastly, who wrote down like a hat? Why would a hat be useful at like a point dispensing site?
I think several of us put hat in. I know I put hat in because you know, from my experience at Waterworld, it was the sun was so glaring and it was so warm, and to be able to just also take that glare off your eyes a little bit, but it was so warm, and so I think a really nice wide brim hat or a baseball cap to kind of protect your eyes and your face and your head from the sun is really important. And then weather changes. So it can get, you know, you can have the hat on and then you might take it off because it may get super windy. But I just feel like a hat was something that I stress every day for people to bring a hat. You know, it just helped keep them cool, and protect, you know, their face from that direct sunlight. Did
No, that's
somebody else put a baseball cap on there? Who else put a baseball cap?
I did, and I put sunglasses too.
Yes, that's perfect. Yes. Yes.
all right. Thank you all. Let's move on to the next knowledge track.
And Cameron, just from a time perspective, we said we were going to wrap this up at 7:30, and I still have a
Okay.
couple of slides.
That's
Okay.
fine.
Thank you, Mark.
That's perfect.
All right. Go ahead. You can either scan that QR code or go to menti.com and basically answer, should you show up at a point of dispensing site without instruction or a deployment notification?
Ah,
All right. It looks like the majority of everyone is responding no. Teresa, do you want to go over this one?
Yes. So you actually should not show up at a pod without instructions or deployment notification. It is really, really important to not to self-deploy. And that is really stressed within a lot of our medical reserve corps and our CERT organizations. You need to definitely wait for that actual call, and it basically helps us to be able to make sure that we have the appropriate volunteers on site, and that we don't just have everybody showing up. And so I do understand the maybes, but it's really important that you wait for that direct communication and then you deploy out. And sometimes I've had people just call me, "Oh, aren't you going to call me to deploy?" And I say no. And I said, I'm waiting for instructions as well. So I cannot send you out until I get the appropriate instructions. And that's also for your safety. And safety comes first, very much so. You know, we don't want you to go out to a pod and sometimes, and also for you to be standing around and not know what to do. You know, spontaneous volunteers, generally what happens is if they do show up, that is my role, and I just sort of try to gather them. I've had that to happen and say that, you know, I'll take down the information and I will call you if we need you. But at this point, we'll try to work with those volunteers that are first affiliated. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Teresa. We'll go on to the next and last knowledge check.
That'll be great. Okay.
So, what's the first thing you would do when arriving at a pod or a ship? All right, I think everyone's pretty much got this one. Yeah, it's pretty much a gimme, right? If you haven't signed in before starting your shift, we don't have a record of you being there. So basically, we recommend that for everyone both to sign in, and someone did receive the safety briefing. That would be the next step. So those are the pretty much the first steps you would do when arriving at a pod. So, all right. So before we conclude, Teresa and I just kind of want to make a little outreach effort for our different programs at Contra.
Right. So we have, as I said earlier, I'm volunteer coordinator, and so I do manage the Medical Reserve Corps. And so if and we're constantly welcoming new members. So if you're definitely interested, you can definitely, there's going to be some resources. You can take a screenshot of my QR code and get in touch with me. We're also going to have this link on our resource page. And so we'll be able to share it with you. But if you're interested, please let me know. And the process for becoming a volunteer is basically reach out to me if you're interested, and I will share with you the types of roles and volunteers that we have. You can move forward, Cameron.
Thank you, Teresa. And so we're also looking for new medical countermeasures partners. They can be open or closed site partners. And again, please just scan my QR code and we'd be happy to talk with you about becoming an open or closed site partner. And now this is more for organizations, but just a little bit about the process of becoming a partner is that once you fill out basically and send me your contact information, we'd set up a meeting to talk about becoming a partner, and then we'd do a site walkthrough of the site that you would recommend for becoming a point of dispensing site. And then finally, once we kind of agree on the layout and setup of the site, we'd enter into like an MOA or an MOU, a memorandum of understanding. And then finally, that site would be honored as a point of dispensing site in the Contra Costa Health Medical Countermeasures Program. So that's basically the gist of kind of becoming a point of dispensing site partner for the MCM program. And we just want to thank you guys all for your time. And that link right there is actually a link to various resources that we would recommend either for volunteers or point of dispensing sites. So are there any questions?
So Cameron, before we take questions, if you could stop sharing for a second and let me
Yep.
share my screen.
Okay.
And I'm gonna drop that link into the chat as well.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. I just want to bring home, we have in this audience today a lot of existing certs, but we also have a few students who are currently in the Walnut Creek CERT basic training program who are going to graduate next Saturday. So I want to make sure that everybody remembers the value of their CERT training, and Teresa is a CERT as well. Teresa mentioned it. We have a basic safety orientation. We are known quantities. So we are registered disaster service workers, and therefore we have taken an oath to follow the direction, to follow the mission. We follow the incident command system, so we're not going to go rogue. We're not going to self-activate. We always operate as a team. We're never off running on our own. These are core, these are fundamentals of our training and our program. And of course, a lot of the services and the skills that Teresa and Cameron talked about are trained in our program, everything from people and traffic management, disaster psychology, to our patient approach training, our auxiliary communications training, have and will continue to be really valuable both within the city of Walnut Creek or the city of your CERT program, and as a support for county operations. And indeed, many CERT organizations, I show this slide every time we have a monthly meeting with Walnut Creek CERT. I can name for you any local Bay Area organizations, CERT organizations that have provided these kinds of support services. And it's just important that you remember the value of your training and keep your training up with active service. There are a number of Walnut Creek CERTs who are also in the Medical Reserve Corps, so there's no reason why you can't be a member of multiple service organizations, and we encourage that. So with that, Teresa and Cameron, there are a couple of questions in the chat. If you want, I can read them. One question was about spontaneous volunteers. You talked about that, but about any concerns that you may have with spontaneous volunteers. I think you talked a bit about a number of ways of screening.
Right.
Yeah.
So there is lots of concerns that can come with being spontaneous volunteers. One of the things we do try to really, really hone in on is that they receive none of our patient information, that they're not in any of our patient facing clinical situations. So and when they come in as spontaneous volunteers, basically my role is to have them fill out a DSW form and swear them in. And so that information is all I actually gather at that time. So I definitely try to place them in roles in which they're not going to be privy to any specific information about a patient or, any of our operations per se, that they can do any damage to. Actually, I've been, knock on wood, I've been very, very, very successful with a lot of the spontaneous volunteers who, after our big water world setup, came back and says, I want to volunteer. I want to be a true volunteer. And so I think that is also a good way to outreach. And some just said, okay, I'm here. I live in Alameda County. And I would ask them, what brings you this far? And they were like, well, I want to volunteer. I was like, okay, but I try not to turn people away, but there was a limit that I could use every day. And so I made sure that once I received that limit, I was like, everybody, and once they gathered, I would just say, wait here until we find out what we need. And then most people would say, okay, well, do you need anybody tomorrow? And they would come back, or I would just have them fill out the form and I would reach out to them if we needed them. So like I said, it's, we help each other out.
Yep.
Being spontaneous volunteers.
Very good. Another question, being ADA accessible, Cameron, you mentioned that earlier. What accommodations are made for people with hearing loss? Everyone thinks of wheelchairs when they think about ADA, but of course, people have all different kinds of abilities.
So for anyone with hearing loss, whether it be as a volunteer or for a patient coming to the site. Sorry, I'm just looking for a little bit clarification on that.
I think the thrust of the question was, when you say that the selection of sites has to be ADA accessible, one often thinks of wheelchair accessible, but you also, in these sites, you strive to accommodate all disabilities, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So we briefly mentioned it in the beginning of this presentation, is that all local health jurisdictions are part of the Bay Area Mass Prophylaxis Working Group. And within that working group, we've created documents for people that are either like hard of hearing, and there's different ways to kind of like communicate with that kind of like population and everything like that. And so one of things that we worked on as a group, as part of the working group, is basically a guide of pictures. And basically, if we do run into that problem of there's like communication, the screener or whoever's using that guide can point to the different pictures within that guide, and it basically says what the action or what they're trying to communicate. And so that's one of the ways that we work with people with access and functional needs and different communication.
Very good, very good. A couple of questions. One was, can we get a copy of the presentation? And also, can we get a list of the acronyms in alphabetical order with an explanation of each?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Margaret will send you the presentation afterwards
Thank
to
you.
send out to the whole group, and then we'll also provide
A list,
a huge list of acronyms and kind
Right.
of explanations.
We're actually building on our list because me and Cameron come across acronyms every single day. So that's just one of our big projects, actually, to go into all of our plans that we're developing. So hopefully we'll be able to share that acronym list with you, Margaret.
Very good. And with your permission, I would like to take the recording of this presentation and make it available on the Walnut Creek CERT website. And I can make a list of acronyms available because I think the more prepared our population is, the better off we are.
Yes.
Good. Anything else? Teresa put the link for resources in the chat. I see no other questions. So I am very grateful, Teresa and Cameron, for your evening. Thank you so much. It was very interesting and it hit exactly the target of what I was looking for. So thank you so much.
And thank you for inviting us, Margaret. We appreciate the support and we look forward to working with all of you in the future. And we hope it's not anything too detrimental, but just also, stay in touch. That's the important part. All right. Take
All right.
care.
Thank you
thank you,
very
everyone.
much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank
you guys.
you.
Super
Good night.
helpful.